Welcome back. We are joined today by Alex Krainer, a market analyst, author, and a former hedge fund manager to discuss the Iran war and the reactions in the market. So thank you for coming back on the program.
Thank you for the invite, Glenn. Always good to join you.
Well, I said Iran war. I guess technically it's peace now, or a ceasefire, but it's not upheld very well. And the chances of this transitioning from a ceasefire to an actual peace agreement, I mean, I tend to be very pessimistic. That being said, the markets seem to be very optimistic. It's as if the conflict and all the underlying causes have already been resolved. How are you assessing this? The ceasefire which has been reached and the way the markets have reacted.
Okay, let me knock out the markets first. I've spent my professional life, in the markets, actively trading commodities, financials, currencies. I would read exactly zero into that. The fact that the markets feel optimistic doesn't mean a thing at all. Markets can be very, very delusional in the short term, and they often are. And that short term, it can last. As they say, markets can remain irrational a lot longer than you can be solvent. So I would read exactly zero into that one. With regards to the, how do you call it, the very surprising announcement of ceasefire yesterday, I have to say I was very surprised. And yesterday I wrote an article for my newsletter, and it took me, I think, about 3 or 4 hours to write the article. And by the time I wrote the thing, because as I was writing out my sentences and paragraphs, I would often go online to check, to do a bit of research to make sure that I'm not writing out nonsense. And basically, by the time I got to the conclusion, my conclusion was that it's very unlikely that the ceasefire will hold, and that I think that the probability that it will lead to peace is very close to zero. And in fact, before I hit send on that article, I went one last time online to see where we were, and I saw that the ceasefire was already being breached, that the narrative was already coming apart, and that all makes a very poor foundation for peace. But more importantly, we have to always go back to the ultimate incentives for war in the first place, and that is, we have discussed this before. This is the conquest of collateral. And if you follow day-to-day news, you would think that it's about Strait of Hormuz, it's about women's rights, it's about the veils, it's about the clerical regime in Tehran, freedom and democracy, ballistic program, nuclear program, all these things. All of these are merely pretexts. The ultimate reason is that Iran is 5th or 6th wealthiest nation in terms of natural resource wealth. They are estimated to have about $35 trillion in natural resource wealth. And if the Western Empire, which still enjoys the support of the United States as its military enforcement arm, if they could gain political control over Tehran by installing maybe the Shah Reza Pahlavi again on top of the government, then that natural resource wealth would become collateral of Western banking cartel. And $35 trillion could go a very, very long way to refloat the system, which is fraudulent and which is currently imploding upon itself. It's being squashed together by liquidity that's being flooded into the system from whole cloth. The problem is that for every dollar, euro, yen, or whatever you have that's printed out of thin air and put into circulation, it dilutes the currency that's already in circulation. So it's making everybody in the system poorer. And this will continue until they manage to conquer new money, good collateral, so that the system can be, kind of reinflated and it can take off the ground again. This is ultimately always the reason for war. This is why all wars really are bankers' wars, and why they will never give up. Because for the bankers, it's either bringing new collateral into the system or it's their whole system imploding. They don't know how to do anything else. They don't plow field. They don't build anything. They don't write novels or symphonies. They do absolutely nothing. They just pull money out of thin air, lend it to us at interest, and then collect services on those debts. That's what they do. That's the only thing they do, and they will sacrifice every nation that they occupy, like the United States, Great Britain, France, and so forth, completely in order for their system to be to survive and to continue.
Yeah, and I'm also often surprised by how people buy into narratives, like you said, believing that all of this is real. All countries through all history have always had to sell wars. Usually, you have strategic competing interests, and they're sold as good guys versus bad guys. I mean, if you look at how things, the governments which were rejected. If you go back to the 90s, Russia was so eager to be part of the West, it was willing to turn its back on traditional allies, former Soviet republics, China, anyone in the East who might slow down its sprint towards the West. But this was not good enough because again, it's a certain size of the country. Same as China. Whenever we criticize China, now it's like, oh, they claim Taiwan. Well, they always did. They never stopped claiming Taiwan. We recognize that Taiwan is, a part of China. What changed is the size of the Chinese economy. It grew more powerful. And as you said with Iran, I think they can open a strip club on every street and follow, adopt every law we have in the West. They still wouldn't be accepted. And but on the other side of that coin, we will back genocide, which we have proven. We will put in ISIS leader in Syria. We'll back actual Nazi groups, and as Trump suggested, willing to kill an entire civilization, and we'll have the NATO Secretary General cheer it on. So the idea that this is all about values and principles and headscarves, I mean, it's quite ludicrous, and it's also a bit frightening, I have to be honest, when people actually buy into that this is why we are bombing, well, not we, why the U.S. and Israel is bombing Iran, because they want to liberate women. I mean,
Yeah,
every time. I mean, it's yeah.
I have to say that amazes me, because we have seen this film so many times before. They always demonize the other side in order to justify the war. But it was just a few years ago that they were doing the same with, when they wanted to go to Syria. Then Bashar al-Assad was the worst person in the world. He was killing his own people, and then before him, it was Muammar Gaddafi. He was killing his own people, and Saddam Hussein was a madman. He was killing his own people, and Slobodan Milosevic was a madman. And then in other parts of the world, you had Salvador Allende. He was a communist, horrible, horrible. We have to go kill him too. And Daniel Ortega, he was horrible. He had to be done. And Arbenz and Noriega and Hugo Chavez and Emmanuel, no, not Macron, Nicolas Maduro and in Cuba, Justin Trudeau's father, Fidel Castro, sorry. So we always create these villains, and then we pretend that we're going around the world slaying dragons, slaying evil to make the world safe for democracy and human rights and progress and so forth. But it's as if nobody looks back to remember these stories, and then to look and to say, well, where exactly did we create this shiny example of prosperous democracy? Look at where Syria is today. It's in the hands of an Al-Qaeda terrorist who just until recently had a $10 million bounty on his head. Today he's an honored statesman everywhere in the West. And then look at Libya, which used to be the most prosperous African country with the highest standard of living under Gaddafi. Now it's a failed state with open slave markets and ruled by warlords. Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, everywhere we went, we created mayhem and destruction. And we caused immeasurable pain to the people, destroying their countries, destroying their infrastructure. Yet, there are still people who buy the story every single time. That is just amazing. I suspect that we're arguing with artificial bots in bot farms, because I can't believe that anybody is that stupid. It can't be.
I remember the scandal. There was some CIA papers that was leaked, I think, by WikiLeaks, that in Afghanistan there were, the war was losing its appeal. So the occupation was losing its appeal among the Europeans. So the CIA suggested, let's, frame it as being about women's rights, because that's popular in Germany, France, and the countries where they're losing interest. And and you didn't even need the leaks. That's their job. You have to sell the war. I mean, and it's just, I don't know. I got sidetracked. It always shocks me to see that people are actually buying into this. Yeah.
When it comes to women's rights, let's go back to Afghanistan. The United States withdrew from Afghanistan in August of 2021. They were there to bring democracy and freedom. And then when they withdrew, everybody had their hearts broken over the rights of women and girls. And I don't know if you remember, but for a period of several weeks, you couldn't even turn on the TV without hearing women and girls uttered 100 times. It was all about women and girls. But then when you look at the achievements of Western occupation of Afghanistan, you found that more than 50% of all children born in that time when the United States was in charge of Afghanistan, the children sustained permanent stunting for malnutrition. So more than half of the children were stunted for malnutrition for life because the women did not have enough food to give to their children. So what are we supporting women and girls for? To have only fan accounts and to become professionals running I don't know what in their cubicles and to commute to and from office every day, and then I don't understand. And but the frustrating thing is that there's always a segment of the West that's willing to swallow absolutely any lie that is thrown their way.
I remember after this report came out about Afghanistan, you even saw. I remember there was an article co-authored in The Guardian by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and got some Hollywood celebrity Angelina Jolie with a title something along the line why NATO is now the leading organization to protect women or something. I mean, you can't make it up, but people want to believe this, and this is important. It's in human nature. You want to see that you're on one of the good guys. That what you're doing, what you're participating in, what's being done in your name is for something greater, and then just some horrible selfish interests. But let me ask about this ceasefire, because one of the reasons why it got off to a rough start was obviously Lebanon. That is, the main mediator or one facilitating or proposing the peace agreement or ceasefire was the Pakistani Prime Minister. He confirms that Lebanon is part of the peace treaty. The ceasefire, and shortly thereafter, Israel begins to bomb the hell out of Lebanon. Which is kind of strange that they would wait for this vicious attack onto the first day of the ceasefire. But put that aside, the Americans also came out and said, well, Lebanon's not part of the ceasefire. What do you make of this? Was this just a way of allowing Trump to step down a bit after he made these crazy remarks? Or was it the Israelis stringing the Americans along? Or how do you make sense of this? Because this, could be what sinks the whole ceasefire, though.
Well, again, if I was going to be charitable to the Trump administration, which I no longer see any reason to be, but if I was thinking from their own point of view and pretended that they have some constructive goal in mind, I would say, well, this has been such an embarrassing defeat for them that for domestic audiences they need to pretend that they're in charge, that they're in control, that it was Iran who came crawling to them begging for a ceasefire, and that they are dictating the terms of the ceasefire, of negotiations. We all know that this is not true, that the reality is that the United States has been begging for a ceasefire, and that the Iranians are in control of the framework for any negotiations. So the 10 points are Iranian. They have been carefully formulated. They have been carefully communicated by the Pakistani Prime Minister to the American side. It has been received as such. There's no doubt about that. And if people in the United States can read and write English, then they understood the message and they know what the message contained. And there's no doubt about it that Lebanon was included in that in those communications. So now to pretend that no, we never said anything about Lebanon, this is very disingenuous, and I think that it will only move those consumers of the news cycles that don't really pay close attention to events and don't have an attention span longer than that of a goldfish. Most people can tell that there's a deception. Why? I think that because Trump administration has to pretend that they're in control, that they're winning, that this ceasefire is the result of their glorious victory over Iran. They have to also show to the Zionist elements who have apparently predominant influence in American foreign policy that they're not putting any constraints on Israel. But if I was more critical, I would say that this is very typical, that the United States is treaty incapable. We already know now that while they were negotiating with the Iranians in February, they were sending weapons to the Kurds to infiltrate Tehran and to prepare a color revolution. So they were preparing the bombing campaign, and they were already activating the Mossad and CIA elements to try to overthrow the government while they were negotiating or pretending to negotiate with the Iranian government. Now, apparently, there are reports about a large surge in American troops in the region in an apparent preparation for a ground invasion. I think they're talking about 50,000 troops, which I don't understand. I don't see what they hope to achieve with 50,000 troops. But, we saw all these videos with Chinook and these other helicopters bringing an aircraft bringing American troops from the United States to the Gulf region. For what reason? It's not for picnics. Obviously, they're coming to attempt to wrest control over the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz from the Iranians. But they need time for this, right? They need time to prepare that ground invasion. And I think that this is why the United States asked for a 45-day ceasefire rather than 2-week ceasefire. Iranians agreed to a 2-week ceasefire under certain conditions. But I don't think this is going to hold. And I think that at best we're going to see a 2-week ceasefire and then renewed hostilities.
Yeah, well, I can't imagine 50,000 troops going very far in terms of trying to seize the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, this, as Lindsey Graham said, once we get the Strait of Hormuz, we're going to make a ton of money. How do you, yeah, again, this is what's interesting with the Iran war, though. That is, the narrative control is quite horrible compared to all the other wars. There, everyone has marched in line. They all made clear that this is about good values versus bad values, civilization versus the barbarism. But on this one, Trump keeps making references to, we're going to get all their oil and we're going to destroy their civilization. It's a little bit like Venezuela. I think the Europeans would have gone fully along with it if they would just have changed the language, stop talking about the oil and talk more about democracy or freedom or human rights or something, and then they could have, put their full weight behind it. But what is the economic relevance, though, you see, of the Strait of Hormuz, or the, I guess, political economy might be more apt?
Okay, so that's the part where I'm a little bit confused. I mean, it's not confusing what the impact of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is. That's almost obvious, 1/5 of the global oil supply is constrained. 1/3 of the supply of natural gas. No, sorry, 20% of natural gas. This is much more. Oil will continue to flow, but natural gas will not. Apparently, the Qatari ability to export gases, I think, is now shut down completely and probably won't be brought back online very, very soon. And then there's a question of urea, the feedstock for artificial fertilizers. Almost inevitable result will be famine in large swathes of the world. So, this misadventure might cost millions, maybe tens or hundreds of millions of lives in the global south. And who knows where else. We'll find out how severe it will be. So that's not confusing. What is confusing, Glenn, is that, it was not so long ago. It was in January of this year that Trump brought his delegation to Davos. And they pretty much declared war on globalism. They said that globalization failed, that they were talking about implementing the American system of political economy. The Secretary of Trade, Jamieson Greer, in his remarks, he explicitly mentioned Alexander Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln and so forth. So to me, I thought, okay, this could not be more clear and more explicit. The Trump administration has made their intentions very clear, very categorical, and so this must be it. Which what does that mean? Embracing the American system of political economy. It means that you bring your capital, your resources back home. You impose tariffs to create a protected market for your manufacturers and mom and pop businesses, and you allow your economic system to invest itself at home, to to build prosperity, to repair the infrastructure, to create jobs that pay good salaries, to go back to the economy where one blue collar income could support a family and put children through school and university and so forth. And so I thought that made all the sense in the world. And I kind of believed it because Trump has made those remarks repeatedly over many years. And then he's been trying to, we know this from insiders, whether, Colonel Douglas McGregor was an insider to the previous administration. And it appears that Trump definitely wanted to bring American troops back home from Syria and from Iraq and from Afghanistan, which is also part of all this. You want to bring your troops home. You don't want to waste the nation's resources policing the world and maintaining hundreds of military bases everywhere. And then Trump also wanted to bring troops back from Germany even. And we know that there was tremendous pressure exerted on him in 2019 to go to war against Iran. And he said no, he declined that. So I was kind of inclined to believe that he was sincere and that he really wanted to turn away from being the global hegemon. So if that were the case, then the Strait of Hormuz wouldn't matter all that much to the United States. That is, it will be a secondary thing because the United States is very much self-sufficient. They have their own oil production. They have Venezuela and Mexico there in the neighborhood. They have Canada to the north, all very resource-rich nations. And so, American economy could have restructured in accordance with the American system of political economy. And I thought I believed in a very bright future, longer term for the United States. Maybe the following 10, 15, 20 years at least. But something happened on 28 February, and he did what he knew not to do in 2019, and what every president before him knew not to do, because there were all these reports, all these intelligence findings that kind of built a consensus that attacking Iran would be a colossally idiotic thing to do. And if we go back to that famous speech by General Wesley Clark when he said 7 countries in 5 years, right? The timeline for those 5 years starts in 2001, which would imply that the neocon plan for Iran was to regime change it within 2006. Well, we are 20 years past that point, which means that all of this pressure, all of this burning desire to take control of Iran was never realized because nobody dared, because everybody knew it was mission suicide. And I believe that we've discussed it on your podcast as well, that it was obvious that it was mission suicide because Iran had all kinds of capabilities to make this a catastrophic endeavor for Trump. So I was convinced that he wouldn't do it because who is that dumb? Nobody. It just can't be. Well, he went ahead. He pulled the trigger, and now we are where we are. And I think that the consequences will be very disastrous. Only, I think that they will be more disastrous for Europe and for Great Britain than they will be for the United States. United States has many ways to cushion the blow. As I said, they are a very resource-rich country. They have resource-rich neighbors. They obviously have no problem of using their political and financial and military power to bludgeon their neighbors into submission and use them effectively as their colonies. So I think that the United States will not be able to avoid a stagflation from this, but I think that Europe and the United Kingdom will have a much more severe crisis as a result of it.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Europeans. I was looking for a segue there, anyways. But I was wondering how they will be affected by this, because Trump isn't wrong. Even though he started the war, it's not the United States that's so reliant upon this. It's Asia and Europe. And I just saw now, was it 2 days ago, 3 days ago, the Financial Times, they had an article with the headline, something along the lines that the hedge funds are making now record bets against European stocks. So in other words, they're betting on things going south in Europe fairly soon. So how are you assessing, or what are your expectations? Because even if this ceasefire would hold, the war would be over. There's a lot of damage that has already been done. And by the way, the Strait of Hormuz is not open. So how do you make sense of what's going to happen to Europe now?
Europe has largely painted itself into a corner. They, cut their access to Russian oil and gas deliberately, in spite of the fact that 1/4 of Nord Stream pipelines is intact and could deliver, I think, 25 million cubic meters of gas per year, if I remember. It's from 100 million or billion cubic feet or meters. I forget the exact number, but it's a very large number. Quarter of that could still be delivered to Europe, but they won't have it because Russian hydrocarbons are not worthy. We're too good for it, and so no deal. Even at a cost of destroying the European economy. Instead, they decided to rely primarily on Qatar and the United States. Now we know that Qatar cannot deliver anything either, and now we know that the United States might blackmail Europeans for access to natural gas. And so they've really put themselves in a very, very difficult situation. And but then there's another very, very significant vulnerability to European economies, and that is that most of the global trade is still conducted in U.S. dollars, and under conditions of distress, European banks have had a lot of difficulty with dollar liquidity, and the U.S. side, the Federal Reserve, has kind of helped them out by creating these very large swap lines so that Europeans can access dollar balances to conduct foreign trade. But all these swap lines could be canceled at any time, and they might not be canceled under Jerome Powell, but we're going to have a new Federal Reserve chairman that will be nominated by Trump, and so that relationship might become very rocky. And I know as a fact that European bankers are extremely worried about this. So if they lost, if they had to buy dollars at market prices, and euro could collapse. The euro could collapse, and the result would be a big jolt to the inflation, price inflation in euros. It would be a crash of the euro. It could be a crisis of stagflation, because you would get very sluggish or no economic growth and accelerating levels of price inflation. And so that brings us to that falls already on how do you call it, a lot of dry tinder for social revolt, because people are already suffering in Europe. I think that according to Eurostat, and these figures are a few months old, so it might be worse by now, but across the Eurozone, about 35% of all households in Europe have difficulties making ends meet, and in some countries it goes beyond 2/3. So 2/3 of all families have difficulties making ends meet. That's not prosperity. That's not economic success. That's a society that's moving closer and closer to the edge of a massive social revolt. And so I think that, and then like people who are specialists in this area say, like I'm talking primarily about David Betts of I think Imperial College in London, who's saying that European nations are now explosively configured for a breakout of civil wars. And so we might be looking at revolutions and social uprisings or civil wars in many European countries. And I think that the ruling establishment will try to avert this by orchestrating a major war against an external enemy. And I think we know what we're talking about here. And I think that the whole continent is being prepared actively for a big war against Russia. And I think that this big war might take a few years, but I think that unless we push back very decisively against this, Europe might share the same destiny as Ukraine.
Yeah, the language coming out of Europe is quite extraordinary. And you would assume at some point that the reason would start to kick in, and if you see that, we don't get the energy we needed from the Middle East, we don't get it from Russia, the United States becoming more unreliable. At some point, you would seek to diversify and improve some of the relations which have been harmed. But there only seems to be an effort to double down though on this continued proxy war against Russia, and I think one of the triggers could be this efforts of seizing Russian ships, which they will now see as a possible flashpoint, or even allowing Finland, the Baltic states' territory to be used to strike Russia in the north, or even the Scandinavians for that matter. Um, how do you see the world, I guess, reconfiguring? Because they're not the only ones. So the Europeans, I mean, I hate to say it as a European, but we're not doing very well on the international ranking of reason and rationality. I think it was the foreign minister of Hungary who made that point, that we have a crisis of reason in Europe now. But how do you see the rest of the world, though? Because the Gulf states paid a very heavy price for being frontline states for the United States. And I hear, if you follow some of the media in East Asia, you see that this is also a concern there. Like, why did we bet so much on this partnership with the US? Where will they actually protect us, or will they lead us into trouble? So how do you see, I guess, we should, this many variables playing out at the same time, one shouldn't make too many bold predictions, I guess. But where do you see the overall trend going in terms of the world changing? Sorry, very large question.
Yeah. Look, I think there's going to be massive fracturing in the Middle East and in Europe, and I think it's going to result in the prevalence of a multipolar global order. I think that the United States will have to withdraw into its own hemisphere, and will have to find its identity, whether it wants to be a hegemon or it wants to be like a pivot power in its own, how do you call it, in its own hemisphere that actually has good constructive and friendly relations with its neighbors. But I think in order for that to happen, you're going to need a complete reformation of the monetary system, because going back to that saying that all wars are bankers' wars, United States is still completely dominated by the banking oligarchies, and they don't see the world as you and I see the world. They see the world as slave labor and natural resources that have to be turned into financial flows that only accrue to their banking institutions. And they, that's their levers of power. That's all they know how to do, and that's all. That's the only plan they have. But with regards to the Gulf states that you mentioned, I find it very amazing. I think that Henry Kissinger famously said that it is very dangerous to be an enemy of the United States, but it is fatal to be a friend. And I think that they're now just learning that this is actually true, and it seems that it's their turn now. I thought that Saudi Arabia would have wisened up to this a little bit at least, because they have been at the receiving end of some very nasty stabs in the back from the UAE and Israel, and they've been setting up military outposts in Somaliland and in southern Yemen, practically surrounding Saudi Arabia and making it very, very vulnerable to being simply cut off from global trade. And then when you look at so many of these IDF soldiers that have, on their uniforms, they have these shoulder patches of Greater Israel that includes a very large chunk of Saudi Arabia as well, you would think that they would choose the side of Iran in this war, because obviously the UAE, Israel, and the United States will ultimately cost them their kingdom. Once Iran is out of the way, well, the next easy picking, low-hanging fruit would be Saudi Arabia. But for some reason, instead, they joined the other side against Iran, which to me is amazing. But I think that the explanation is that Saudi Arabia has, I don't know how much money exactly, but I think it's more than $1 trillion sitting in their accounts with the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. And they've seen what Western bankers will do, what they would dare to do to Russia, even though Russia is a nuclear power. So I think that if they chose the wrong side in this war, that they would be cut off from their money and they'd probably never see it again. And I think that this is the reason why for them maybe the short-term considerations are much more important than the longer-term considerations. And I think that the ultimate result is that a lot of these Gulf kingdoms will disappear, and then Saudi Arabia maybe will be reconstituted in some way. But I think that as far as Iran, Russia, China are concerned, they probably have no choice but to push these conflicts all the way to the point where they will create a completely new and different security architecture on Eurasian landmass, because this British geopolitics, where you're constantly fomenting wars everywhere against any power against any power to keep everybody weak and divided, and make sure that they are the clients of Western banks and Western corporations or Western military-industrial complex. I think that has to end because it's just creating millions and millions of casualties of war, destroyed economies, suffocated growth, suffocated development. And I think that people now understand that if you allow this to persist, it's always going to have exactly the same results as it has done over the last 200 years.
Yeah. So what you mentioned before that you were optimistic about Trump because of, well, essentially what appeared to be economic nationalist policies, which fit into the whole American system. So I'm thinking Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, this whole system followed on with Friedrich List and others. But there appears now that even the Iran war follows a little bit the logic of something different, that is going back to empire. Because if you look at all those things that are infrastructure that's being hit in Iran, all the railroads, the ports, a lot of this is the corridor that connects Iran with China, but it's also the international north-south transportation corridor, which connects Iran with Russia and India. So this is, it seems that the way they're prioritizing this infrastructure, which has been built up over the years now, is to essentially take a sledgehammer towards this whole greater Eurasian project. And of course, if you can't regime change Iran and make it into a new Syria, just fragmented and chaotic, then at least destroy all the infrastructure. I'm not sure if you see it the same way. Do you think this is still a war aimed only towards Iran, or do you think Russia and China are also targets here?
Oh no, this juggernaut never stops. I think that if they manage to overthrow Vladimir Putin's government in Russia, that they will use Russia against China in exactly the same way that they used Ukraine against Russia. So they take over political power in a country, and then they use that country's economic and military power to turn against the next victim. They didn't go fight Russia themselves. They militarized and weaponized Ukraine to fight Russia. And then if they succeeded, they would militarize Russia against China. And then if they succeeded in Iran, they would probably cut off Russia from its north-south international transport corridor. They would force Russia again to depend on the Arctic and the Suez trade routes. They would continue using their divide and rule until they had complete and total hegemony over the Eurasian landmass. I mean, this is the Macandarian politics that goes back to, I would say, probably quite a bit longer than 100 years, where, the British have perfected this system of constantly using war and intrigues to pit power against power, to keep them all weak, and to dominate everything. And there isn't a point in time or space that they say, right, okay, so I guess we have a big empire now. We have a bunch of really rich colonies that we exploit. We can stop here. They never stop. And whenever any nation becomes a bit more powerful, a bit more prosperous, kind of like Libya, that want to be left alone, that they want to develop their economies for the benefit of their own people, it has to be destroyed. So that, that malignancy never rests. It always is looking for targets to attack, which is why we're in this state of permanent warfare now. And, all of these wars are coming from the West. They're not being instigated by Iran. They're not being instigated by Syria, by Russia. It's always the West that is fomenting these wars.
I agree.
Yeah, and the dynamic always leads back to the financial centers, to the banking oligarchies.